So we'll start off with Marc Weisskopf. He's a neuroscientist and epidemiologist who's been specialized in the environmental impacts on neurological disorders, including autism and the whole range of autism spectrum disorders, along with quite a range of others. He'll give us the basic biological and sort of epidemiologic information on autism in particular. Marc?
Okay, thank you, Alec and Miguel and others and the panelists for inviting me and getting to talk about this very important topic. I'm sure we'll have great discussion. Do I see mine here? How do I do this? With this one. There we go. Okay. All right. So just to jump into autism spectrum disorders. So it was first, these disorders in general, these sort of behaviors were described by Leo Kanner here in the United States in the early 40s, where he described patients who had a series of types of symptoms that he described that fell generally in his description into by the way, I'm told I'm not supposed to walk around, which is very hard for me, so I'm going to try and stay right here. Three general areas: social interactions, communication, and stereotypies, where you're sort of doing, like, you can imagine, you might all know a little bit about autism, sort of flapping type behavior, for example. That's one example of it. A sort of abbreviated list of some of these falls into that group, things like inability to develop relationships, non-communicative use of speech. But notably, a couple things, there can be some very positive aspects about this, like very good, probably supernormal rote memory, for example. So it's a complicated disorder. Also, this asterisk about it being, he described it as early onset, that it has to start early in life. That's changed a bit in how that gets viewed now. In terms of how we diagnose this and how we can find it, so when he first described it, there was no diagnostic and statistical manual of diseases. That came, the first one, in 1952, and there was no category for autism. The types of behaviors he was describing that might be captured in that were under things like schizophrenic reaction of the childhood type. Later in DSM-2, that was still no autism. It was still sort of in a schizophrenia kind of model. It only got an actual name of infantile autism, where that first got into the DSM in 1980 in DSM-3. The revision referred to it as an autistic disorder. In the DSM-4 in 1994, they introduced this category of pervasive developmental disorder, or PDD, which is, so this was a separate category, but still sort of lumped into this umbrella, this spectrum of autism spectrum disorders. Most recently in 2013, they switched from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, and that was a rather large switch in sort of how they conceptualized autism spectrum disorder. For many things, they kind of, a lot of things went on, but to sort of simply summarize, they collapsed a bunch of things. So it's now just autism spectrum disorders. There isn't Asperger's, which you may have heard of, pervasive development disorders, not these different categories, but just one group of all of these, and they sort of melded two of Kanner's original groupings, social and communication, together. A few other things happened as well. They also made a little bit of a nod towards, while it sort of has to have appearance of having started early, an understanding that the full manifestation of these behaviors may not come till later, until certain demands require those kinds of behaviors. So you wouldn't fully manifest until later in life. But it's very important to keep in mind that autism and the clinical world and the people you will talk to are very adamant about this is autism spectrum disorders, right? They don't necessarily view it as one thing, and it doesn't look like one thing. And it has a very wide range of traits that underlie it. So there are a variety of scales that you can kind of measure different traits on. A classic one is the social responsiveness scale. And if you just apply this in a population, you'll see a distribution a little bit like this. You get a long tail, but it's one that sort of blends into the normal population, right? So this is not, and it has, as we'll get to, a wide variety. So there's a lot of things going on with these underlying traits for autism. There's a lot of sharedness, and we'll get into the heritability of this too, but this is some work of others as well as me and others here. And Alberto, you may be on that paper too, yes, I think you are, yes, about traits in the nurse's health study. And just to point out things like These are controls, but these are the controls whose parents don't have elevated social responsiveness scores, so aren't sort of exhibiting behaviors like autism. These are the control kids not deemed autism spectrum disorder whose parents do express more of those types of behaviors. So you can see already they start to shift a little bit in their patterning of types of behaviors. Kids that are actually diagnosed as cases also show differences, whether their parents also show some elements of these traits or not, right? So there's a lot of building of these types of behaviors, and we see that within families and across families as well. Also sort of related to this is that there's a really high comorbidity with lots of other types of conditions. The ones that are most often talked about are intellectual disability, ADHD, epilepsy also, but things like motor impairment, metabolic disorders, and a host of other things that we see in children with autism. There's a lot of gastrointestinal problems in children with autism, so there's a lot of question about what's chicken and what's egg, but there are a lot of additional comorbidities that come with autism spectrum disorder. I'm putting this in because one of my clinical colleagues would kick me if I didn't, right? So this is an example of how varied the autism spectrum phenotype is. And some common myths that she insists we always talk about is, the myth is he doesn't have autism because he does talk and he looks at me and he interacts with me in the office and he's interested with other kids and he's not flapping and rocking, right? That does not mean the kid does not have autism. There's a whole variety of other types of behaviors that could still get you classified as autism. It is also a myth that she does not have, or that she does have autism because she doesn't talk, doesn't make eye contact, and flaps or rocks. People will do those types of behaviors and yet not qualify on intense sort of clinical workup for what we call autism spectrum disorders. Now, all of you are probably aware of the sort of massive rise over time in what I guess I'll refer to as identified prevalence of autism spectrum disorders. This is I hope not too complicated slide, but each line here is a birth cohort. X-axis is the age that they're attaining, and the y-axis is the cumulative incidence for autism spectrum disorder in a national database in Israel. And this is for financial benefits for families with children with autism, and there is a very sort of rigorous process of sort of proving that the child has autism through medical visits and the like to get this. And I put it up here just to show you a few things. I mean, one is if we take age 8, and in the United States, the CDC numbers you typically hear come from things where people are looking up to age 8. And we can see as the birth cohort goes up, there's this tremendous rise in the number of cases of autism spectrum disorder in Israel, right? That is seen almost anywhere we look around the world. The things go up. The nice thing about Israel that we were doing this is that the population is actually made up of very different types of people. So there's the general Jewish population, which sort of shows that same type of trend that we see that I just showed you, because this is the dominant population in the majority population in Israel. But there's also Israeli Arabs, where they're in the same general area, so they're not like totally separate from the general Jewish population. And we still see a rise. It's slightly less of a rise, but it also kind of doesn't take off at the same time. It takes off a little bit later among these Israeli Arabs. You can look at the ultra-Orthodox Jewish population, where there's also a bit of a rise, but it's a little bit of a muddied rise in when it happens, and it doesn't seem to really start taking off if we again look around 8 or maybe 5 or something until maybe a little later in the 90s, right? So I put this up here to show a few things. One is there's a rise going on, and we see it all over the place, right? In this context, I would say it's a little hard to believe that there's something kind of environmental driving this whole thing that is sort of acting at different times on different aspects of the Israeli population. So I think there are other reasons why these things can go up, why we see more. And there's actually, Bert Hoffman just sent a article in the European Journal of Epidemiology that sort of goes over this, Eric Fonbon, lots of data from all over the place about other potential reasons than a true rise in incidence. Why am I not? Here we go. Of autism spectrum disorders, right? So I think there is reasonable evidence that other things are happening, like changing criteria. I showed you the DSM different changes and things like that. Switching, instead of calling someone schizophrenic, they're going to call them autism spectrum disorder. Awareness of this as a disease and classifying it. Willingness to access services that then get you, called a case for autism or found as a case of autism. So there are a lot of opinions out there. People have different opinions. I feel like there's a lot of evidence that a lot of things are contributing to the rise. There's a lot of variability, even in the US data that we see across the different states when the CDC gives you those numbers. There's like 5 to 10% differences across the different states that are giving the numbers that feed into that, right? So there's a lot of reasons why we could see rates going up that are not related to a true incidence increase. Is there room that there could also be a true incidence increase of some sort going on? Possibly. I think it's really hard to do with the way we do these kinds of studies. So I'll leave it at that, but it's a difficult question to get at. I have to go back to the neurobiology because of my neuroscience. So I'm going to give you some history too. In 1981, these three gentlemen won the Nobel Prize in medicine, physiology or medicine. Roger Sperry for something else, but David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel were right down the street at the Harvard Medical School, and they won the Nobel Prize for understanding and describing a fundamental, what we now understand is a very fundamental aspect of the development of the brain. And it's illustrated here, where's my pointer, with inputs coming from the eye through the thalamus to the cortex, the outer part of your brain, visual parts in the back. In an immature animal, when the animal is born, the brain develops, cells get born, they migrate, they move to where they need to go, and they kind of over-connect all over the place. So if you look in a very young cat, which is what they were looking at, you will see inputs from the left eye and the right eye all across the visual cortex. As a function of activity, so using these inputs, like I need to take advantage of that visual input and use it for some purpose, that actual activity-dependent process creates a sort of learning process in the brain that winds up sculpting a final architecture of the brain, which is very dramatic in the visual cortex because there are columns in the cortex that are devoted to one eye or the other, and they're totally separated. And that happens through synaptic mechanisms, neurons talking to each other and either working well or not working appropriately for what they're doing. And this process happens over development. It's a critical period. Eventually that sort of stops, and this final architecture is set up that's shown here below. And I bring it up because we think this underlies some of the theories about the biology of autism, which I will also say we don't really know very well, but this is part of what we think is going on. And some of the things that are proposed and thought to be going on in autism is that there's this imbalance between excitatory activity and inhibitory activity in the brain. There's various levels of evidence for sort of macrocephaly, as if there's too much out there in the brain, essentially bigger brains. That may change as you get a little bit older, but at least initially starting that way. And overall general altered connectivity between brain cells. And one of the classic things, the main, I hate to say main because there's so many, but one of the things in autism is it's a sensory processing issue. And one of the problems if your brain is not sculpted properly is that you don't process that information appropriately. And there's some thoughts that essentially too much is coming in. So even that sort of rocking and flapping activities may actually be a sort of attempt to sort of minimize the activity coming in so that they're not flooded with information, right? But the key point to this is that some of these theories about what's underlying the biology that's underlying autism relates to how these neurons connect in synaptic activity in the brain and how that brain may get set up. So one of the ideas is that sculpting may not have happened appropriately. And so that's also one of the reasons why you might see a slightly too big brain because you've got too much connectivity going on. Intriguingly, when we sort of look at the genetics, and I'll get into genetics of autism very briefly, but what the sort of genes we see that are very prominent in autism are very enriched for synaptic proteins that control this connection between neurons. So it does seem like something is going wrong if you mess up how neurons talk to each other. That said, there's another all right, I gotta go really fast. There's another aspect to the brain that's hugely important for the kind of things we're talking about, which is that microglia and the immune system play a very important role in developing the nervous system. So I won't go into the details, but in particular, microglia, the sort of resident immune cell in the brain, play huge roles in setting up the brain and developing it. They are actually also central to this pruning process, so that when actually one cell is talking to another and that one they decide shouldn't be there and you take it away, microglia come in and they kind of essentially phagocytose it and get rid of it. And intriguingly, although we do see gene variants that are enriched for synaptic issues, we see enriched gene expression for microglial type genes. And we see microglial development index getting higher and older. And when you look at brains of children with autism, we see microglial activity. There's a big interest in the issue of maternal immune activation as being one of the risk factors for autism from both animal and human work. I'm going to really have to zip through. This is sort of the timeline of autism. Leo Kanner, and that's Hans Asperger, described it about the same time in the 40s. I think it's Daniel Rimland, I'm forgetting his first name at the moment, but he was actually an academic and parent of a child with a disorder, but not an academic in this field, but he proposed that this is something biological going on. And I think because he wasn't square in the field of this area, but Bruno Bettelheim was, Bruno Bettelheim is unfortunately the father of the refrigerator mother hypothesis, that it was how the mother interacted with the child, and that's what caused it. That held sway for many years until Folstein and Rutter came around and did the first twin study, where they clearly, it was a small study, so we have to give it that, but it showed a very high heritability of autism. Subsequent to that, we've entered a time when maybe environment is considered a bit more. Now maybe we're thinking environment and genetics, that they're combining in some way. Since the Folstein and Rutter twin study paper, many of these twin studies have been done. I won't go into them all, but to sort of summarize, there's a very high heritability of autism from these types of analyses, somewhere 60 to 90%, depending on who you're talking to. I will say that if there are gene-environment interactions going on, this kind of complicates the assignment of heritability. Known genetics from single SNPs or copy number variants or polygenetic risk scores only account for maybe 20%-ish of autism cases. In terms of etiology that's non-genetic, sort of proof of principle that something else might do something, there are both animal and human studies of valproic acid during pregnancy leading to things that look a lot like autism, thalidomide exposure in people. Actually, that was also in Sweden a long time ago, very small. These are small. Rubella infections. All these things seem to lead to something in the children that looks like autism. There's plenty of studies of environmental exposures and sort of neurodevelopmental issues. So they kind of give a proof of principle that something exogenous might be able to create an outcome that looks a bit like autism. If we want to think about timing, there's a lot that sort of points at the pregnancy period. All of the stuff above were things that occurred during pregnancy, so that's part of the evidence, but you can also look at brains of children who died young with autism, and I will say that these are small studies and selected, so there are all of those issues, but they do show some things anatomically that suggest that something was already going on in the in utero period, like cerebellar cells or cortical patterning, things of that sort. In terms of the etiology and risk factors epidemiology that's been done, a variety of things have been looked at, and some are reasonably well replicated, like advanced parental age, preterm birth, pregnancy complications as shown here, all these types of things. Some protective, folic acid early on in pregnancy, potentially protective. There are some environmental exposures like air pollution and to some degree pesticides we can talk about. Some of those hard to pin down exactly what it is. Less consistent things like vitamin D, endocrine disruptors, other lifestyles. I had to put it in there because everybody talks about it, not vaccines. There's a lot of data that just simply says they are not related to autism, so that has to be stated. One thing I did not put in here that I should, that's quite important, is that, I don't know whether you want to call it a risk factor or not, it's a heavily male-dominated disorder. It's like 4-to-1 in terms of males to females. So that is in itself interesting. The expression can be slightly different in terms of the symptom profile. It's also rather interesting in that regard that some of these microglial effects that I told you about, in animal models, males much more sensitive when they're exposed to other things and their effects on microglia structure and function. So there is sort of animal evidence of a susceptibility on the male side. So in summary, what do we know? We know that they're neurological disorders. There's a very wide variability in phenotype. Prevalence is increasing, strong role of genetics and heritability, but only about 20% we understand from genetics. Inflammation seems to be important. There is evidence for exogenous factors and prenatal changes. What we don't know is exactly why the prevalence is increasing. Is it just that we're looking more, that kind of a thing? What's the exact pathophysiology, etiologies? And a lot about the genetics and interactions between genes and environment. So I will leave it at that.